Hello and most welcome to 1686 of the series. As an introduction to Paul Johnston and Joachim Schulte and Paul Livingstone's more complicated interlocutions of Wittgenstein, I will today commence with an article of Edmund Dain, Wittgenstein, Mind Reading and Perception. I will begin to give you an introduction by reading the abstract. Can we perceive others' mental states? Wittgenstein is often claimed to hold, like some phenomenologists, that we can. The view thus attributed to Wittgenstein is a view about the correct explanation of mind reading. He is taken to be answering a question about the kind of process mind reading involves. But although Wittgenstein claims we see others' emotions, he denies that he is thereby making any claim about that underlying process, and moreover denies that any underlying process could have the significance it is claimed to have for this debate. For Wittgenstein, the question is not, is this perception? But what do we mean by perception here? And that question is answered by investigating the grammar of the relevant concepts. That investigation, however, reveals similarities and differences between what we call perception here and elsewhere. Hence, Wittgenstein's answer to the question, can we perceive others' mental states? Is yes and no. Both responses can be justified by appeal to different concepts of perception. Wittgenstein then has much to contribute to our understanding of mind reading, but what he has to contribute is nothing like the view typically attributed to him here. Introduction. This paper focuses on mind reading and Wittgenstein's views about that. The term mind reading here does not refer to something extraordinary, such as telepathy. On the contrary, it refers simply to our everyday ability to tell what others are thinking or feeling, to read their thoughts and feelings. But although that ability is very ordinary, it is no less amazing for all that. So amazing, in fact, that it is not clear, at least to many philosophers, that it is really possible at all. My question is not whether mind reading is possible, but what mind reading involves and what Wittgenstein thinks about what it involves. There is a long tradition in philosophy of holding that if we are able to tell what others are thinking or feeling at all, that ability cannot be explained in terms of perception alone. It can't simply be a matter of seeing or hearing, say, another's mental states. Rather, it must involve some kind of post-perceptual mental processing that goes significantly beyond whatever is involved in or revealed to perception alone. Contemporary views about what that post-perceptual processing involves can be divided into two main groups. Proponents of theory claim that it involves inferences drawing on a theory of mental state attribution. Proponents of simulation theory claim that it involves an inner simulating mechanism through which we identify what our own mental states would be under similar circumstances. Wittgenstein is often taken by figures including Sean Gallagher et al., Dan Zahavi, to represent the view that our ability to read others' thoughts and feelings can, in many cases, be explained in terms of perception alone. In this, Wittgenstein's views are held to agree with those of phenomenologists such as Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Such a view is typically attributed to Wittgenstein on the basis of a series of remarks from his later manuscripts on the philosophy of psychology. There, Wittgenstein writes, for instance, that we see emotions I do not surmise fear in him. I see it. But despite these remarks, I shall argue that Wittgenstein does not hold that our ability to read others' thoughts and feelings can be explained in terms of perception, since these remarks do not have the significance for Wittgenstein that is ascribed to them by others in outlining his views. Whereas Wittgenstein is taken to be offering an explanation of the nature of mind reading in terms of perception, Wittgenstein himself explicitly denies that he is doing any such thing. For Wittgenstein, the mere fact that we use the word seeing in this context does not tell us anything of the nature of mind reading. He also denies that there is a deeper question about the correctness or incorrectness of our use of the word seeing, of the kind he is typically taken to be answering. That, however, does not mean that Wittgenstein has nothing more to contribute to our understanding of mind reading, but only that his contribution does not take the form of an explanation of its nature. His aim is not to give an explanation of mind reading, either in terms of perception or post-perceptual processing at all. Instead, Wittgenstein aims to describe the concept of seeing involved by describing its grammar, and in doing so to clarify both the similarities and the differences between that concept and what we call seeing in other contexts. In this way, Wittgenstein aims to overcome the resistance we may feel to using that term in connection with mind reading. Wittgenstein's remarks then, I argue, contain an approach to mind reading that is original and significantly different from the view typically attributed to him. Those remarks also form an important supplement to Wittgenstein's discussion of other minds in the philosophical investigations. There, Wittgenstein undermines the thought that we cannot know what others are thinking or feeling. But he does not address the further question of how we know these things, not now a skeptical question. Implying that we cannot know them at all, but more simply a question about the possible sources of this knowledge. Moreover, Wittgenstein's views are important for a further reason. Part of what is at stake is a more general question about how we can and cannot use Wittgenstein's thought in ways that are faithful to his own understanding of his work. To engage constructively with contemporary debates, in this case in philosophy of mind and cognitive science, and in connection with that, questions about both the similarities there may be between Wittgenstein's thought and phenomenology, and the role of ordinary language within Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Whereas Wittgenstein has been taken, along with Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, to hold a specific view about the nature of mind reading that can be used to confront head-on the claims of many contemporary theorists. I argue that Wittgenstein at least do not hold such a view, and that he rejects the assumption about the importance of ordinary language he is held to appeal to in arguing for it. Instead, Wittgenstein rejects the central question of that debate as confused and aims rather to describe the relevant concepts of perception by describing their grammar. Two, mind reading and perception. Can we perceive others' mental states? It is a simple fact about the ways we speak in English and many other languages that we can at least sometimes perceive what others are thinking or feeling. That is, it is quite correct as far as the use of the words go, to say in certain circumstances that we perceive another's thoughts or feelings. According to those ordinary forms of expression, we can perceive others' thoughts and feelings using a variety of sensory modalities. We can, for instance, see the delight in another's eyes or face, hear the happiness in the laughter, or even feel the affection in the touch. Moreover, again, according to our ordinary forms of expression, we can perceive others' thoughts and feelings, both in the sense that we can perceive what they are thinking or feeling. We can, for instance, see the anger in someone's face, see that they are angry, hear the sadness in someone's voice, and hear that they are sad, and feel the fear in another's grip, and feel that they are afraid. The range of what we say can say about what we can perceive of another's thoughts and feelings. In these ways, though it differs with the sensory modality involved, is extensive. Here, for instance, is a rough, open-ended list of examples of mental states that we say are, at least sometimes, available to perception by one or another of the senses. Anger, joy, happiness, delight, sadness, grief, pain, kindness, consideration, spite, malice, deceit, attention, boredom, interest, curiosity, etc. By the lights of our ordinary forms of expression, then we can perceive others' thoughts and feelings by sight, hearing, or touch in an extraordinary array of different cases. It is tempting, however, to think that these ordinary forms of expression must, in some sense, simply be mistaken. It is tempting, that is, to think that we cannot see or hear or feel these things at all, so that these expressions are, if taken literally, straightforwardly wrong. Rather, the correct explanation of whatever process is involved in what we call seeing or hearing or feeling in this context must appeal to something over and above mere perception. After all, how could we perceive these things? There just is. It is tempting to say no such thing as perceiving a mental state. The idea that we cannot perceive others' mental states functions as a central premise in the traditional problem of other minds. The problem of explaining how knowledge of other minds or of others' mental states is possible, and so of justifying our belief in the existence of other minds. It is essential that the problem that we cannot simply perceive others' mental states directly, since if we could, there would not be a problem at all. The problem of other minds begins, at least on one common formulation of it, with the assumption that what we can perceive of other people is only ever a matter of their behavior, such as movements of their bodies and the sounds they make. But none of that, the thought goes, amounts to perceiving a mind or a mental state. Hence, the evidence we receive through perception is logically compatible with the absence of other minds. Moreover, the idea that we cannot perceive others' mental states is very widely held, so widely held, in fact, that it is often taken to be too obvious to be worth arguing for in developing the problem of other minds, and sometimes not even worth explicitly acknowledging at all. Bertrand Russell, for instance, in his famous response to the problem based on analogy, takes it to be so obvious that we cannot just perceive others' mental states, that for him it literally goes without saying. He moves straight from the claim that we observe such occurrences as remembering, reasoning, feeling pleasure, feeling pain in ourselves, to wondering what kind of postulate could be involved in ascribing these states to others. The thought that we do not observe them in others is passed over in silence. By contrast, Alvin Goldman claims explicitly that others' mental states are not directly observable. But Goldman likewise takes that claim to be too obvious to be worth arguing for. Three, Wittgenstein on mind reading. For many then, as presumably for Russell and Goldman, the claim that our ability to read others' thoughts and feelings could be explained in terms of perception, so that our ordinary forms of expression are correct, deeper, non-linguistic sense would simply be absurd. But Wittgenstein, by contrast, is often claimed to hold precisely that. There's a little note that he's defended. That view is ascribed to Wittgenstein on the basis of a series of remarks from his manuscripts on the philosophy of psychology from the later 1940s, such as the following selection from Zettel. I interpret words, yes, but do you also interpret looks? Do I interpret a facial expression as threatening or kind? That may happen. Suppose I said it is not enough to perceive the threatening face. I have to interpret it. Someone whips out a knife at me, and I say, I conceive it as a threat. And the next quote from Zettel. Consciousness in another's face. Look into someone else's face and see the consciousness in it and a particular shade of consciousness. You see on it, in it, joy, indifference, interest, excitement, torpor, and so on. The light in other people's faces. Do you look into yourself in order to recognize the fury in his face? It is there as clearly as in your own breast. And what do we want to say now? That someone else's face stimulates me to imitate it, and that I therefore feel little movements and muscle contractions in my own face and mean the sum of these. Nonsense. Nonsense. Because you are making assumptions instead of simply describing. If your head is haunted by explanations here, you are neglecting to remind yourself of the most important facts. Next quote. If you only shake free from your psychological prejudices, you will find nothing queer about the fact that the glance of the eye can be seen too. For I also say that I see the look that you cast at someone else. And if someone wanted to correct me and say that I do not really see it, I should take that for pure stupidity. We see emotions opposed to what? We do not see facial contortions and make inferences from them, like a doctor framing a diagnosis to joy, grief, boredom. No, we describe a face immediately as sad, radiant, poor, even when we are unable to give any other description of the features. Grief, one would like to say, is personified in the face. I will put my quotes here. Well, an easier introduction to the difference of Wittgenstein. He changed radically in his view during his own lifetime. The view that you cannot see facial expressions as emotions or understand that other people are conscious could be said to be the view of his earlier self. When he was finished with his magnum opus Tractatus, he, so to speak, went into the world. He worked as a school teacher in an ordinary village in the Austrian countryside. He lived in a cabin close to a Norwegian fjord and did some other things, not looking more into philosophy. But something caught his interest, and one of those things is famously noted by Ludwig Wittgenstein himself, when he said in his old way that all expressions in the world are mirrored in the world. All words, concepts have a reference in the real world. An Italian economist, Piero Sraffa, made a Napolitanian gesture, putting his hand under his chin, and asked Wittgenstein, "What is the reference of this in the world?" Wittgenstein was shaken in the very depth of his convictions from this. And that was one of the fueling impetus for what later become philosophical investigations, settlement, remarks on the philosophy of psychology. He departed distinctly from his old friend Russell. I would like to quote on page 678, and that's the fourth quote on Zettel. We see emotion as opposed to what. We do not see facial contortions or make inferences from them, like a doctor framing a diagnosis to joy, grief, boredom. We describe a face immediately as sad, radiant, bored, even when we are unable to give any other description of the features. Grief, one would like to say, is personified in the face. It is in our language, and it has always been. And Wittgenstein is one of the very few philosophers who wants to go in and clarify this, that we sort of lost our footing in language. And he, by the way, I need to mention this for you who are new to Wittgenstein. The grammar of the language is how it's supposed to be used, but not an a priori grammatical rule, but what works, what makes sense, what functions. There is a quote from Wittgenstein, meaning is use. We are active. And I would make a really wild parallel here. I mentioned Rolf Pfeiffer, Dr. Pfeiffer, the Swiss inventor, researcher, and genius, who say that motion is the soul, shows that intelligence is in the motion, not a static computer-like brain. It's only one F for some reason. The soul is in the moving body, and the body is never material or biological. The body is how we interpret the world. And the body is a process. When reading Wittgenstein, you get a feeling that the psychological self that is a recent invention has replaced the soul and has made us soulless. Because without a healthy moving body, the thing that Wittgenstein here is referring to, joy, anger, resentment, happiness, that is the soul playing. But with the psyche, all those things are gone. Wittgenstein is a herald of the spirit in this aspect, I would say. Some comments from Kalle.
Yes. Edmund Dain says that he wants to examine emotion in Wittgenstein, but he doesn't take up the problem of evolution in Wittgenstein. It seems that Wittgenstein had the same convictions all his life, which is not the case. You know that he changed much. And I would argue, hope that all scholars on Wittgenstein would not do the mistake that Edmund Dain is doing here, that they're putting out the date of the latest edition of his works. Wittgenstein, he died already in 1951. He's not writing here after his death. So I would recommend, I hope that I urge all Wittgenstein scholars that they write out the date first when Wittgenstein actually published or wrote these thoughts, and then within parentheses perhaps the latest edition. 1970s, of course, I think the edition of this posthumous edition of his works, and this is very misleading. Is this a young Wittgenstein? Is this the old Wittgenstein? No distinction at all is done here. Everything is like the same Wittgenstein. But besides this, I think that the young Wittgenstein, but perhaps also Edmund Dain, is doing the mistake. They are unconsciously following Saussure. That is, you have you do what you saw a sign, and it should correspond to one feeling, like the mistake or the thing that was pointed out about the Napolitan guy you mentioned earlier. No, it's not actually that. Okay, so say that there is one corresponds to each gesture in face. Let's say that a smile is always happiness, but it can also be irony. So we have to remember that there is not one thing that corresponds to one thing, but many things at the same time, many feelings at the same time, and that I would hope that Wittgenstein, older Wittgenstein, also shared that view, I think. And you remember we had discussed in the past Edmund Barth's book, The Empire of the Sign, and before Barth went into Japan, he was a semiotist in social school, more or less. That is, he thought that one expression corresponds to one thought, but the Japanese had they had faces without expression, so to say. They were so social changed his view there because he saw that you cannot really interpret their faces. That was one thing. He had to change his view. That one face can show several expressions at the same time. I think that is exciting. And I would also say that there is not two different processes. First perceiving and then interpretation. But I think that they absolutely occurs at the same time. It's not that if a person comes with a gun at you, that you think you have to first see it and then you interpret it, but that they occur at the same time. So there is absolutely no difference between perceiving and interpreting.
Yes, like in the doctor's example here, you don't look at someone's face and then you have framing of a diagnosis. It is immediately, and what is going to happen later, not in this article, but when we go into Wittgenstein, it is not only about face at all, it's the whole body. And actually, the whole body is necessary to know what someone is feeling or what it's about. I think I mentioned that many episodes ago, that looking at tennis players, and do you remember this? I had photos of their faces. It was impossible to tell whether they won the game or lost the game. And then you could see the whole body. And there was no doubt whether they lost or won the game. But the face didn't tell anything about the real thing. So later it's going to be an expansion. I think face could possibly be seen as examples to start out with. And yes, as you say, they are multivalent.
Multivalent, absolutely.
Yeah, like Solomon. Definitely. I'm afraid we have to end here because Friday is an earliest day. Do we have any concluding words?
No, no.
Then we end there. Thank you very much for participating, Kalle Lundahl, and thank you for viewing. And I now stop the recording.
Thank you.